There is a silence in the desert that costs $5 million a day. If you stand in the Agadem Rift Basin of eastern Niger today, you hear only the wind. The deep, rhythmic thrum of heavy pumps, the sound of prosperity flowing through 2,000 kilometers of steel, has stopped. The pressure gauges read zero. The longest cross-border crude oil pipeline in Africa, a marvel of engineering that was supposed to transform two nations, has become the world's most expensive empty tube. This is not a technical failure. There is no leak, no rust. The paralysis of this $5 billion infrastructure is a crime scene, but the weapon was not a bomb. It was a signature on a government decree. We are witnessing the aftermath of the Niger oil pipeline shutdown, a geopolitical disaster that turned a dream of economic independence into a nightmare of diplomatic blackmail. And the lessons it teaches will reshape West Africa for decades. To understand why this silence is so deafening, you must grasp the sheer scale of what was at stake. For Niger, one of the world's poorest nations, this pipeline was the only way to bring its vast crude reserves to global markets. Before the coup of July 2023, the country produced just 20,000 barrels per day, barely enough for domestic consumption. The new pipeline, built by China National Petroleum Corporation, CNPC, was designed to export up to 90,000 barrels daily, nearly a five-fold increase that the World Bank projected would make Niger Africa's fastest-growing economy in 2024 at 6.9%. This was the money for schools, for roads, for the army fighting terrorism in the Sahel. For Benin, the coastal neighbor hosting the terminal, the pipeline was a lottery win. They didn't have to drill a single well. They just had to let the oil pass through. In exchange, Benin stood to earn tens of millions of dollars annually in transit fees, passive income on a national scale. The $5 billion investment from CNPC bound the two nations in a steel embrace. It was supposed to be a model of African cooperation, landlocked wealth meeting coastal access, with Chinese capital stitching it together. It became a trap. In mid-2024, the government in Cotonou made a calculation that will be studied in political science classes for decades as a masterclass in failure. President Patrice Talon looked at the map. He saw that Niger was landlocked. He saw that the oil had nowhere else to go, and he decided to use the pipeline as a hostage. "If you want to load your oil in our waters," Talon announced in May 2024, "you must consider that Benin is not an enemy country." He demanded that Niger reopen its land border to Beninese goods, a border closed since the July 2023 coup, before any tanker would be allowed to load at the Semé terminal. It was a classic blockade strategy. Talon believed he had his neighbor in a chokehold. He assumed General Abdurrahmane Chiani and the military junta in Niamey would panic, beg for mercy, and open the gates. He forgot one crucial detail. He forgot to check who actually paid for the pipe. Benin's mistake was assuming this was a two-player game. They thought it was Benin versus Niger. But standing silently in the background, holding the receipts for $5 billion in investment, was the China National Petroleum Corporation. And the dragon does not like it when you touch its gold. The pipeline that snakes through the Beninese countryside is not just infrastructure. It is the physical manifestation of a massive CNPC investment. The China National Petroleum Corporation is not a private company in the Western sense. It is an extension of the Chinese state. When Beijing puts $5 billion into the ground, it is not gambling. It is securing a strategic asset. For China, the Niger-Benin pipeline was a perfect project. It adhered to their strict policy of non-interference. They built the wells in Agadem, laid the steel across the desert, constructed the terminal at Semé. Their only goal was to extract the oil and ship it to energy-hungry markets in Asia. They did not care about the coup in Niger. They did not care about democracy in Benin. They cared about the flow. When President Talon threatened to stop the ships, he broke the cardinal rule of dealing with the dragon. You do not weaponize Chinese assets to fight your local political battles. Benin treated the pipeline as if it were their property, a garden hose they could turn on and off to punish their neighbor. In reality, they were holding a Chinese wallet hostage. This was a miscalculation of catastrophic proportions. In the eyes of global markets, Benin transformed overnight from a stable transit hub into a risk factor. They proved that their signature on a transit agreement was worthless if the political wind shifted. China does not invest billions to have its infrastructure sit idle because two neighbors are arguing about a bridge crossing. The anger in Beijing was quiet, but it was intense, and it had consequences. The government in Cotonou assumed that General Chiani would be desperate for oil revenue. They thought the military junta needed cash to pay the army and civil servants, that the threat of blocking exports would bring Niamey to its knees within weeks. They were wrong. Instead of sending diplomats to beg, Niger's military leadership sent an order to the engineers at the Agadem oil field. The order was simple: shut it down. In June 2024, the pumps at the Kulele pumping station went silent. The flow of crude oil dropped to zero. The steel serpent died in the sand. This was the scorched earth economic strategy. Niger effectively said, if we cannot export our oil with dignity, nobody will get the oil at all. Adding to the chaos, a Nigerian rebel group, the Patriotic Liberation Front, claimed responsibility for sabotaging a section of the pipeline in June, threatening more attacks if the $400 million deal with China wasn't cancelled. The group, led by former rebel leader Salah Mahmoud, took up arms after the junta came to power, further complicating an already volatile security situation. For Benin, the shutdown was a fiscal disaster. Hervé Akinocho, director of the Center for Research and Opinion Polls in Benin, estimated the country was losing approximately $7 million daily from oil transit fees alone. The national budget had already factored in this revenue. Suddenly, that line item vanished. The port was empty. The pipeline was dry. The double dip of revenue Cotonou was banking on had turned into a double deficit. But the pain went deeper. The shutdown forced CNPC to suspend operations at the Agadem field. Storage tanks filled to capacity with nowhere to send the crude. Hundreds of local workers were sent home. Chinese technicians sat idle in the middle of the Sahara. Niger was willing to hurt itself, to prove a point, to show the world it would not be blackmailed by a coastal power. While the silence in the Agadem oil fields was absolute, the noise in diplomatic channels became deafening. The shutdown started a countdown in Beijing. For Chinese strategists, the situation was unacceptable. They had spent years negotiating, building, drilling. They had navigated the complex security landscape of the Sahel, and now their $5 billion asset was being held hostage by a coastal government that seemed to have forgotten who really owned the pipe. The pressure on Cotonou began to mount, not with public threats, but with the terrifying weight of private diplomacy. Ambassadors were summoned. Meetings were held behind closed doors. The message from CNPC was crystal clear: fix this. Benin found itself in a geopolitical vice. On one side, they had their traditional Western partners and ECOWAS whispering in their ear to maintain the hardline stance against Niger. On the other side stood the dragon, holding the bill. China made it known that they do not care about the political color of the government in Niamey or Cotonou. They do not care about coups or democracy. They care about contracts. They care about return on investment. And right now, Benin was the obstacle. This was the moment the government of President Patrice Talon realized the magnitude of their billion-dollar mistake. They had assumed China would pressure Niger to capitulate. They thought Beijing would call General Chiani and say, "Open the border so we can get our oil." But Chinese analysts looked at the map and saw the reality. Niger wasn't blocking the trade. Benin was. By linking the pipeline to the border closure, Benin had politicized a commercial project. They had violated the sanctity of CNPC's investment. Diplomatic sources suggest Beijing threatened to reconsider broader infrastructure support for Benin, roads, hospitals, future loans, if the issue wasn't resolved. The cost of blocking Niger's oil was suddenly threatening to bankrupt Benin's future development. This is the nature of Chinese anger: cold, calculated, and purely transactional. Caught between the rock of Nigerian defiance and the hard place of Chinese debt, Benin cracked. In late 2024, after months of tough rhetoric, the Beninese government abruptly announced the lifting of sanctions and the opening of the border. It wasn't a change of heart. It wasn't an act of brotherly love. It was an act of pure panic. By August of 2024, the pipeline was flowing again. The Liberian-flagged crude oil tanker Aura M loaded approximately 1 million barrels of Nigerian crude at the Seme terminal and departed for China, scheduled to arrive on October 10, 2024. Niger had resumed exports, but the damage was done. As one agent with the West African Gas Pipeline Company told Reuters, the 90,000-barrel-per-day pipeline was operational again, but the trust that had been broken would take far longer to repair. Hervé Akinocho noted that even before the pipeline crisis, Niger had already rerouted most of its trade through Togo. The transport sector in Benin was devastated, and the pipeline shutdown only deepened the economic wound. The Niger oil pipeline shutdown was meant to be a chokehold, a way to force a sovereign nation to its knees. But in the high-stakes game of West African geopolitics, a blockade is only effective if your target has nowhere else to go. While the cranes in Cotonou gather rust and the steel serpent lies dormant, the architects of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, are already redrawing the map of African energy. They have realized that a single pipeline through an unreliable neighbor is not an asset, it is a liability. The first alternative is the Eastern Bypass. For years, the project to link Niger's oil fields to the existing Chad-Cameroon pipeline gathered dust on a shelf. It was considered too expensive, too complex. The betrayal at the border changed the mathematics. In June 2024, Niger's Council of Ministers decided to revive the Chad-Cameroon option, establishing a committee to oversee the project. This route would connect the Agadem Basin to the Conakry pipeline, bypassing Benin entirely. The cost would be billions, and the engineering challenges across the heart of the continent are monumental. But after witnessing how easily a coastal power can weaponize a transit agreement, the Sahel states have decided independence is worth any price. Sadiq Abba, president of the International Center for Studies and Reflections on the Sahel, CIRS, warns that securing investment for a new pipeline will be difficult. There is no telling whether anybody will want to invest, he said, but the map doesn't stop in the east. To the south, a new energy giant is awakening. Nigeria, once a nation that exported crude only to import expensive refined fuel, is transforming into a regional refining hub. In February 2026, Dangote Petroleum Refinery and the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited, NNPC Limited, committed to a strategic partnership aimed at transforming Nigeria's energy landscape. During a high-level visit to the Dangote refinery complex in Ibeju-Lekki, Group Chief Executive Officer Engineer Bashir Bayo Ojulari witnessed the plant operating at 661,000 barrels per day, exceeding its 650,000 nameplate capacity. None of us ever thought it would even touch 550,000, Ojulari admitted. This plant is a source of national pride. Aliko Dangote himself described the partnership as central to the refinery's founding vision, stating it could revolutionize the African market. The vision is a regional energy loop. Instead of sending every drop of Nigerian crude to Europe or Asia through potentially hostile ports, the oil could be refined domestically or processed for neighbors. This creates a sovereign value chain where African oil powers African industries, and profits stay on the continent. This is the ultimate nightmare for the old colonial model, which relied on a hub-and-spoke system where the coast was master and the hinterland servant. By turning their backs on the Benin corridor, Niger and the AES are proving that in a multipolar world, the landlocked curse is a myth. For Benin, the cost of this shift is permanent. In the energy world, trust is more valuable than gold. By weaponizing the CNPC investment, Benin didn't just lose today's revenue, they lost the status of a gateway forever. No global investor will ever look at Cotonou again without seeing the shadow of a political blockade. Ryan Cummings, director of Africa-focused security consulting company Signal Risk, summarized the situation. It is a completely messy situation, and the only way for a resolution is if both administrations directly engage and resolve issues. But engagement has proven difficult. Benin convicted and imprisoned 3 of 5 Nigerian oil workers arrested at the port, accused of using falsified computer data. The arrests prompted Niger to shut the pipeline again, with a senior official alleging their oil was being stolen by other people. The impasse has worsened regional tensions since the coup, with Niger tilting toward Russia in its diplomatic shift and Benin aligned with France and ECOWAS. Even Beijing's efforts to mediate collapsed. Cummings noted a major concern for Niger's military government: whether they have the requisite fiscal capacity to keep paying for public services following the coup, which has made it unable to meet financial obligations such as debt repayment. The Niger oil pipeline shutdown is more than a temporary disruption in trade. It is the final nail in the coffin of the old West African order. For decades, coastal states operated under the assumption that geography gave them a permanent veto over the survival of the interior. They believed that by controlling ports and pipelines, they controlled the destiny of the Sahel. As the cranes in Cotonou stand still and the pipes lie empty, that illusion has finally shattered. The government in Benin made a catastrophic gamble when they chose to weaponize CNPC's investment. They treated a $5 billion strategic artery like a political bargaining chip, assuming the military leadership in Niamey would eventually break under the pressure of lost revenue. They were wrong. Niger did not break. It evolved. By turning off the tap, the alliance of Sahel states proved they value sovereignty more than their balance sheet. They would rather endure economic hardship than remain hostage to an unreliable neighbor. The dragon in the east is watching, and its memory is long. China did not invest billions to have its assets caught in a regional feud. The pressure that forced Benin's desperate U-turn was not diplomacy. It was a desperate attempt to stop complete national bankruptcy. But as trucks remain stopped at the bridge and oil remains in the ground, a new map is being drawn. The Sahel is no longer looking south for permission. It is looking in all directions for partners, from new corridors in Togo to emerging energy loops in Nigeria and Chad. The landlocked curse is being replaced by a sovereign network. The message to the world is clear. The era of the proxy state is over. You cannot build your prosperity on the suffocation of your brothers. If you act as a jailer for foreign interests, you will eventually find yourself trapped in the very prison you built. The steel serpent may one day flow again, but it will never carry the same weight of dependence. The Sahel has learned its lesson, the hard way. The desert is quiet. The pumps are still. But in that silence, a new power is rising, a power that knows its worth, protects its assets, and refuses to bow to anyone. The blockade didn't kill the Sahel. It made it unbreakable. The tap is closed. The bridge is blocked. And for Benin, the price of a lie has just become too expensive to pay.